Okay, okay. Hello, hello. How's everybody doing? Hope everybody's doing good. Okay, so today I wanted to give some evidence for the, drum roll, lost tribes of Israel in Europe. Because we know, hello, Christian Carpenter. Morning. We know that, or it's past 12 already, I guess. But anyway, we know that the Israelites were pushed out of Israel a couple of times. I mean, the northern tribes of Israel. And we know basically where they went. And the same thing happened to the Judah as well, but they didn't go all in the same places. But anyways, I can now prove where the lost tribes of Israel are and where the lost tribes of Israel went for two reasons. One is that the IY chromosome is in the populations of the the Mediterranean people that went to America in the days of King Solomon before Israel broke up. The other one is that by way of the Neanderthal and Denisovan DNA of where Semitic people. Hello, Jerome. I said good morning. Right? Okay. No, I did anyway. Anyway, so there's two good pieces of evidence to show that the IY chromosome in Europe is the descendants of Israel, the sons of Jacob. So, and like I said, the Mediterranean people, the Phoenicians that went to America consisted of the GY chromosome, the EY chromosome, the BY chromosome, the TY chromosome, the R1BY chromosome, the I1, the I2, the J1, and the J2. This is basically Mediterranean people, the Phoenicians, right? It's what they consisted of. They're all found in America, in the American indigenous populations, all those Y chromosomes that I just mentioned, in significant enough numbers to see it on a graph, on a table. So the other one, the other evidence, because that was Israel before Israel split up. So we know that I1 and the I2 Y chromosomes belong to Israel before they split, because they were part of Israel that went to America before they split up. So when they did split up and were driven north, of course, they still had the IY chromosome. So, and of course, if you know anything about the genetics, the I and the J are basically from the same tree anyway. So we know that the tribes of Israel, the Israelite tribes that were pushed north out of Israel, we know they went up through the Baltic, between the Baltic and Caspian Sea. That they went up also through Greece or Anatolian Greece into the Slavic areas, up the Rhine River, all the way to Scandinavia. And the reason we know that is from the genetic information of the I1, the I2. And so we know that they were there. Now the Denisovan and the Neanderthal DNA are significant because Semitic people are not, they're neither Neanderthal nor Denisovan. And the only Semitic people going up the Rhine River through into Europe, through up to into Scandinavia, the only Semitic Y chromosome uh, in those areas is the IY chromosome. So it can be confused with any other Semitic population. I mean, there's a G in Germany too, but not all the way up through Scandinavia. So to me, that's an indication because what happens is when you look at the Neanderthal DNA, people that have Neanderthal DNA are the Eurasians, which would be the R1A, the R1B, the T, the L, the N, the M, the, I mean the the Q and the O. Those are all people that have Neanderthal DNA because they're Japhethite, because Neanderthals were Japhethite. Now the Denisovan DNA is another thing. Denisovan DNA is both Neanderthal and Denisovan. I mean, it's both. Yeah, the Denisovan. Yeah, so the Denisovan DNA is both Eurasian, Japhethite, and Hamitic. So when you look at the map of the Denisovan DNA, people that have Denisovan DNA would be the Hamitic populations, which are Africans and whoever is from the Hamitic family tree, which includes the C and the D that went to Asia. So they are going to show up as having some Denisovan DNA. The uh, the Europeans are going to show up as having some Denisovan DNA because they're Japhethite, because the Denisovans are Japhethite and with a mix of Hamitic, which is the same family tree as the Africans and the C and the DY chromosome. So if you put the DNA on a map, which they have done, the the people that have the Denisovan DNA will show up, and the people that don't have Denisovan DNA are also going to show up. In other words, going to influence autosomally the population, the general population in the area. So when you look at the Denisovan DNA, there's a lack of Denisovan DNA, of course, in the Middle East, which is Arabic and Judaic, and Anatolia, which is Turkey. And then it shows up as being less Denisovan DNA going up the Rhine River into Scandinavia. And you can actually see that there's less Denisovan DNA in those areas. And the reason is because of the Semitic populations in those areas, which the majority of the population in those areas going up the Rhine River all the way into Scandinavia is the IY chromosomal influence. So have autosomal influence on those populations so that they don't show up with as strong a signal of Denisovan DNA. So that verifies to me, since the IY chromosome is the only Semitic Y chromosome of significant population going up into Scandinavia, that to me shows that they are, of course, Semitic, and they are the lost tribes of Israel. Definitively speaking, because they're the ones that were chased out of Israel, and they went both between the Baltic and the Caspian Sea through the mountain pass. There's the I-1 or the I-2 actually. The I-2 is more in that area. Of course, the I-1 too as well. The I-1 as well. But then the I-1 also goes up through the area of the Slavic countries, all the way up into Germany, all the way up into Scandinavia. So they are the lost tribes of Israel. And of course, we know that they became Vikings and Anglo-Saxons, and they invaded England, both Vikings and Anglo-Saxons, and they are the lost tribes of Israel. Definitively. because it can't be anybody else. They can't be anybody else. They have to be the lost tribes of Israel because it's the only population that went that way, went those directions. And now we have the paternal DNA, direct paternal lines of DNA, which are the IY chromosomes, or the Y chromosomes, and I in particular, that show that they're the lost tribes of Israel because it's the only Semitic DNA in the areas. So anyways, I've already touched on it a little bit, but I'm making the observation now that the lost tribes of Israel that went into Europe are the ones that have the IY chromosome, both the I2, which is in the Slavic area regions and the Baltic, Caspian Sea area, and the I1 that goes all the way up into Scandinavia and became the Vikings that went into England, Scotland, and that's where my ancestors are from, or Scotland. So it's definitive that those areas, even you could even see in England where the IY chromosome is in England, that it also affected the autosomal population, affected the population autosomally, so as to have less Denisovan DNA in those areas. So it even affected the population of England or Britain autosomally as well. And the farther you go away from the areas where they had an influence on the population, is the stronger that the Denisovan DNA is going to be, and because it's the Japhethite DNA. So anybody that was more Japhethite has more Neanderthal and Denisovan DNA. So that's about it, and the information just keeps coming in. I mean, when you first start looking at it, you don't realize how far it's going to go as far as the leads when you start following the leads. Because the first lead I got in order to get where I'm at now is I started following the descendants of Nimrod, because I'm thinking, because I have this thing in the back of my mind, the history of the Bible and everything. When I saw the CY chromosome being a Hamitic Y chromosome in Asia, Mesopotamia, I'm thinking, who could that be? Who could that be? Who could that be? And the name, of course, Nimrod comes to mind because he was a significant person in Mesopotamia. He was the king of the Mesopotamia, basically. And so he is the only one, he's the only possible candidate for the CY chromosome. Him and his descendants, his paternal descendants that carried his paternal Y chromosome as direct descendants of Nimrod. So that fit together, beautifully, considering that the CY chromosome goes all the way to America, and you have the Olmec statues with Asian and African features, and they look like Pacific Islanders, which also have the CY chromosome. The Pacific Islanders have the C2, and the people in the area of the Olmec statues have the C3 Y chromosome. It's a different line, but it's from the same origin of Nimrod, the same descendants of Nimrod, made a different line. But they have the same features. The the Pacific Islanders have similar features to the Olmec statues, but they went a different route, of course, and they have a different lineage, but they are from the same original House of Nimrod. So that was my first lead, and that got me going on, identifying everybody. The J1 is basically Arabic and some Israelite as well, because the house of Aaron is J1, and the J2 is basically Judaic, and even probably to a large extent Davidic, descendants of David, J2, because he's a house of Judah, and between King David and King Solomon, they had lots of descendants, so that a lot of the J2 are Davidic as well as being Judaic. So then the closest branch to the J1 and the J2 is the I2 and the I1, which they have backwards. But it doesn't really make a difference. They're just different lineages. It's different. It's a label for a different lineage. But sometimes they get the order in reverse. In fact, it's quite common because the Hamitic populations they all began with E. All Hamitic populations began with E. There's E the Canaanites, E the Egyptians, E the descendants of Put, the Phoenicians, North Africans, and E E the descendants of Cush. They're all E. And then it's a branch off from E would be A and B. So they have it backwards. And C and D is a branch off of E too, because Nimrod is the son of Cush. So we know definitively that they have it backwards, because we know that Cush is the father of Nimrod. So the A, the B, the C, and the D all came after the E, or came from the E's. So they have it backwards in many cases, because of their assumptions, their preconceived notions of the out of Africa belief, and their assumption of genetic distance being the more original or the older genetic line, which makes no sense at all, because we're all supposed to be the same age anyways. every every Y chromosome, there's no one Y chromosome that's older than the other. They're all the same age. But in genetic distance, they're going to show a different genetic distance because of the reproduction rates and the quality of life and all that stuff that affects mutations, because genetic distance, it depends on mutations, the number of mutations. So the more mutations in the line is not an indication of the age of the line. I mean, it's common sense. I mean, if you have common sense, because all the lines are the same age. They all go back to the beginning, and they're all the same age, except that one branched off from the other, but it was early on. So the branches of the C, of course, was very early on. It's Cush's son is Nimrod. That's C. And they basically both had the same Y chromosome. So, but then as you go down through history, as the years go by and the generations increase and multiply, you're going to see the branch off in the different directions as to the number of mutations that they have in their haplogroup, that defines their haplogroup. But it's still interesting to note that Hamitic is definitely A, B, C, D, and E. Semitic is F, G, H, I, and J. And Japhethite is K, L, M, N, O, P, Q, R, S, and T. And it's interesting. The T is the Javans, the original Greek Sea people, and the L is the Thracians right next to them from Tiraz, who is an ancient Greek people who were not as much a sea people as the T. But anyways, and the T is the one that went to America because he was part of the Mediterranean Sea people that went to America, as with a label of Phoenician, because that's not the original Phoenicians. It's just what they called Phoenicians, in the days of King Solomon. The original Phoenicians are the North Africans, descendants of Put. But anyway, it's pretty obvious how things fall into place. They, fit perfectly, because you're talking about 4 sons of Ham, 5 sons of Shem, and 7 sons of Japheth. And we have Y chromosomes that match each one of those populations or genetic family trees. And I was surprised to find that I could match, the lines up with the family, with a different family tree, or what's known as the Table of Nations. Because the Table of Nations is the grandsons and great grandsons of Noah, and I was surprised to find that the Y chromosomes do line up and match up with each of those names of the ancient Table of Nations. But I'm only finding more and more evidence to substantiate this observation, So the IY chromosome is definitely the lost tribes of Israel. No question about it. That would be the I2 in the Slavic areas just to the right of Italy, and the I1, so that went up into Germany, all the way up into Scandinavia, and into Scotland and England as the Anglo-Saxons and the Vikings. And they autosomally influenced those populations where they're at as to have or be having less Denisovan DNA and less Japhethite or less Neanderthal DNA. So all the areas where there's less Neanderthal DNA and Denisovan DNA, those are the areas that were influenced autosomally by the Semitic lost tribes of Israel going up through Europe. So DNA doesn't lie. It's absolute. There's nothing that there's no argument that can be brought up against it. So, which also means that the Bible is absolutely true and the most accurate source of all historical information. And because the Bible is in the middle of ancient history to begin with, it's right there in the middle. Not only is it in the middle, it defines every ancient civilization with the Table of Nations. So the records from the Bible, the first records of the Bible, existed before the Table of the Nations, and it defines the Table of Nations, which are the ancient nations, all of them. And they're all there. So, as confirmed by DNA. So, God bless everybody. Thanks for your participation, and I'll see you on the flip side, as they used to say. All right. God bless everybody.